All right, so remember, the essential question for today is what factors influenced the peace treaties that ended World War I, and how did people react to the treaties? So we're focusing today on making the peace. So there was a lot of costs of war, financial and with soldiers. So the human material costs of the war were staggering. In 1918, in addition to the actual fighting that took place, there was a deadly pandemic of influenza that killed an additional 20 million people. So in addition to the fighting, you have this disease that comes through and wipes out a big chunk of the population. How many of you guys have seen Twilight? Just a handful of you. They actually talk about in the movie how the main character is transformed because of the influenza. He was dying from the Spanish influenza. So there you go. Twilight's somewhat historically accurate. Just the first 5 minutes. So there's a huge financial toll. The fighting was actually taking place in cities, in villages. And so people would have to leave their homes because the fighting was taking place right outside or even within their homes. And so they had to rebuild everything. They had to rebuild homes, farms, factories, roads, churches. They were pretty much refugees that left for a period of 2 to 4 years, and they came back, everything was destroyed, but they had to rebuild. So that cost a lot of money. We can see that from the infograph, the British Empire and Germany both had to pay a lot. France was a little bit less than that, and then Russia, United States, and Austria-Hungary didn't have to pay as much. Yeah, each dollar sign represents $10 billion. So continuing on with the cost of war, people everywhere felt very bitter about the war. The Allies actually blamed the Central Powers. And so the Allies felt like they were the victors. They felt like they were the ones that won the war. And so they demanded that the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, paid reparations. Reparations is when you owe another country money for pretty much losing the war. So the Allies believed the Central Powers lost, and so that the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, should pay Britain, France, the United States money. However, that was a different viewpoint than what the Central Powers had. The Central Powers believed that the armistice was more of a ceasefire, a general understanding that both sides didn't want to fight anymore, and so both sides agreed to stop fighting, instead of, you know what, we lost, so we're signing this treaty. So the actual chart, you've got casualties of soldiers. The red signifies people that have died. The orange is wounded and missing. The blue is taken prisoner, and the green's unharmed. So you can see with Germany, 16% of their soldiers died, 38% were wounded, and I believe that's 10% were taken prisoners. So that leaves only 36% of their army that was unharmed. Same with Austria-Hungary, only 11% of their army was unharmed. With British, France, and Russia, you can see they had higher numbers that were unharmed. Why do you guys think that France had a lot of casualties that were wounded or missing or that died?
Because they were in the middle?
Yeah, because they're in the middle. A lot of the fighting took place in France. It's not only with the cost of war, you have political turmoil that was taking place. The war caused the collapse of governments. That's a real big surprise. Russia, which remember they had a revolution that took place during World War I. And so Lenin, as we'll learn about, actually took Russia out of World War I. So they had a new government. Germany, they were viewed as the loser. They had a new government. Austria-Hungary, again viewed as one of the losers, had a new government in the Ottoman Empire. They ended up falling. The radicals wanted a new social order, so they wanted a brand new government. You had a lot of fear. Conservatives were against communism, which was taking place in Russia at this time. So many people were scared of the communist ideas, and the fact that there was all this unrest meant that communism could have risen up in some countries, and it did with Russia.
So that's when, after World War II, is when communism?
World War I.
Well, I mean, yeah.
Yeah. Communism kind of started back with the Industrial Revolution with Karl Marx, but that was when the idea was invented, but after World War I is when it really started picking up. And then there was unrest that swept out through all the European countries. Remember, we learned about imperialism and how all these European countries had empires, colonies all over the world. Well, these soldiers from the colonies would go and fight for France, for Britain, for Germany, for Russia, and they would realize that these once powerful European countries weren't as powerful as they thought they were. So the colonies kind of realized that, hey, if we keep fighting, these countries aren't perfect. They're not all powerful. They can lose. And so that led to a lot of rebellion in the colonies. All right, the Paris Peace Conference. So the Allies all met in Paris. Do you guys remember the three main allies?
France, Austria-Hungary.
France, not Austria-Hungary.
Russia.
Russia was, but they pulled out early. So France, Britain,
America.
and the United States. So three main allies were in Paris, but so were all the other countries that fought alongside the allies, like Italy, Australia. And they were to meet in Paris and discuss the fate of Europe. The Central Powers and Russia were not invited. Again, the Allies viewed the ceasefire as a victory for the Allied power, and Russia was not invited, even though they fought with the Allies because they left the war early. So this is a picture of the Big Three, the leaders of the United States, France, and Britain.
They all have hats.
They all have top hats. They're all very classy people. So of the Big Three, you've got United States President Woodrow Wilson, the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and then you have the French leader George Clemenceau. All three of these men were very stubborn, and they all had conflicting goals. They all wanted something different. Woodrow Wilson urged peace without victory. So he didn't want the Central Powers to feel like they lost. He wanted everyone kind of form an agreement, work together, help each other rebuild. He had his 14 points. So his 14 ideas, 14 goals to promote world peace. One of which was the League of Nations, which we'll get to in a little bit. So that's one view. The United States, he wants to have everyone unified, support democracy, help each other rebuild. Then you've got the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George. He left England promising to rebuild Britain that was fit for heroes. We won the war. Let's enjoy the spoils of war. This would cost a lot of money. So he went trying to help improve Britain. He didn't really care what happened to the Central Powers or what the other leaders thought. His main goal was to help improve Britain. Then you've got the French leader, George Clemenceau. Remember, the French and the Germans hate each other. Started back with Napoleon, the Franco-Prussian War, World War I. So Clemenceau's main goal was to weaken Germany. Germany's invaded France a couple times now. He does not want to see it happen again. So that really conflicts with peace without victory, because he wants Germany never to rise up again.
So his plans to destroy Germany so they never threaten France again?
Economically.
Okay.
We'll get to that in a little bit. That's a good foreshadowing, though. So there are some problems with peace, though. Remember the Big Three: Clemenceau, David Lloyd George, and President Wilson. Other Allied countries were invited to the peace talks, but they weren't as strong. One of them was the Italian leader, Vittorio Orlando. So he was strong, and he's pretty powerful, but not as strong and powerful as the Big Three. He wanted the Allies, the Big Three, to keep their promise that they had a secret agreement that if Italy joined the Allies, they would gain territory from the Austro-Hungarian lands. And so you've got the Big Three with their own goals, and then you've got these other countries that are like, hey, you promised us this. Like, this needs to happen. And so everyone showed up to the table with their own idea, their own agenda. They wanted to get things done their way. And this led to a lot of problems. Another was self-determination. Do you guys know what self-determination is? Yes, it's self-determination. So self-determination is when you've got an ethnic group that's been living under one of the multi-ethnic empires that wants to create their own country, and they want to form their own constitution, their own laws, and their own way of life. So they're self-determining their way of life. So President Wilson, of the United States, really pushed self-determination. So many ethnic people, they demanded their own nation states. However, a lot of the territories overlapped, and it was really impossible to satisfy every ethnic group. And so this was really bad because it created a lot of minorities in different countries, newly formed countries. And then remember, with nationalism, you've got a strong sense of pride in your national group, your nationality, and that can lead to social Darwinism or racism. And so this led to a lot of civil unrest in a lot of Eastern European countries. So, like I said, Woodrow Wilson had 14 points, 14 ideas about promoting peace. One of them, his most important one, he was very firm on creating an international League of Nations. Does this sound somewhat familiar to something we have today? It's in New York. The United Nations. So, the League of Nations is actually the groundwork for the United Nations. The idea behind it was collective security. Everyone would agree to join, support each other. If someone declared war, they'd be pretty much declaring war on every country in the League of Nations, and so it would prevent that from happening. And the group of nations would act as one to preserve the peace of all. So instead of having secret alliances like before World War I, it was out in the open, that all the countries that joined the League of Nations would support each other, even if it meant going to war. So this was all the Paris peace talks. And then June of 1919, the Allies ordered Germany to sign the treaty. So the Paris peace talks, all these ideas are floating around, and then they created the Treaty of Versailles. So this was the formal treaty that the Central Powers had to sign. So Germany was ordered to sign this treaty. They had no choice. It's either sign this treaty or war is going to continue. There are some very important key points in this slide you guys need to know. So I'd highlight it. First one is they forced Germany to assume full blame for the war. That's going to lead to a lot of resentment for Germans towards the Allies. Between World War I and World War II, there's 20 years. Remember, the Germans are very prideful people at this point. Their country was one of the strongest economically. They had one of the strongest militaries. They felt like they were the new kid on the block. They felt like no one gave them respect. Now they have to accept full blame for the war, when in reality, it wasn't really their fault. They did have a part to play in it, but they weren't the ones that had the full responsibility. All right, so that's the first one. So highlight it, put a star next to it, change the font color, do something with that. The second one was imposed huge reparations. So Germany had to pay back the war debt for all three of the main allies, the big three. Germany had to pay back at that time, $30 billion, which is the equivalent of $2.7 billion, or $2.7 trillion today, excuse me. Where did most of the fighting during World War I take place?
In France.
In France, in Germany, remember the two fronts? So Germany is completely destroyed. So not only do they need to rebuild their own country, rebuild their economy, their infrastructure, they need to help rebuild the Allies' economies. So from the start, people knew this. A lot of people thought this was going to fail. So those are the two main things you guys need to know. Other parts of the treaty were aimed at weakening Germany. So the first one was limiting the size of the German military. So remember, Germany's military was incredibly powerful. They kept the size down, that way it wouldn't threaten France. They had to return provinces, Alsace and Lorraine, to France. That's part of the territory between Germany and France. They also had to remove hundreds of square miles of territory. Germany was split pretty much in half. Eastern Germany became Poland, which we'll see in a second. They also were stripped of their overseas colonies. So out of the big three, which of the big three does it sound like they ended up getting what they wanted?
France.
France, Clemenceau, right? His main thing was to weaken Germany. That's pretty much what happened. Remember, Germany was forced to sign this. They didn't want to, but they had to. So this resentment of taking full responsibility and having to pay an insane amount of money would lead to World War II. It laid the groundwork for chaos in which Hitler was able to rise up from. The Allies, it's important to note, had separate treaties with the other Central Powers. So there's a specific treaty for Germany, for Austria, for Hungary. There's a widespread dissatisfaction with all the treaties. So the Central Powers weren't happy with the treaties, the Allies were. Again, this goes back to the main idea that the Allies viewed the armistice as a victory, whereas the Central Powers viewed it as a ceasefire. So it's two different mindsets right off the bat. You okay, Olivia? Okay.
I started writing the big bullet point, and I only needed to write the little one. Sorry.
All right, and self-determination in Eastern Europe. So Eastern Europe was Russia, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania. So just big chunks of just big countries, old multinational empires. So you have new nations that emerged, where Russia, Germany, and Austria had ruled. So Poland was the eastern half of Germany. Then the western part of Russia became Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And then where you had the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, you have Czechoslovakia, which today is known as Czech Republic, Austria, and Hungary. So Austria and Hungary became their own separate countries. Then south of that, you had Yugoslavia, which became the new South Slavic state. So it's going to be a main Slavic state. Remember, the Slavic people were Russian, so Russia had a strong tie with it. Yugoslavia was mostly Serbia, so it had a lot of Serbian ties. Now if you take a look at the map, can zoom in. All right, so on the left side is Europe 1914 before World War I. Right side is Europe 1920 after World War I. You can see you've got Austria-Hungary, Germany, Russia, Romania, Bulgaria. Now you've got Germany that's split into Germany-Poland. Czechoslovakia comes from Austria-Hungary. Austria and Hungary come from Austria-Hungary. Yugoslavia is combined with Serbia and part of the territory from Austria-Hungary. And then you've got Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia that comes from Russia and part of Germany. It's important to note, Switzerland remains neutral throughout World War I and World War II, even though they're right in the middle of everything.
Was any fighting happening there?
Nope. It's pretty impressive.
Swedish fish. It's the chocolate.
It is the chocolate, or the fact that there's just a giant mountain range that goes around the entire country.
It's awesome.
All right, so another outcome from the peace settlements were the mandate system. So the mandate system is very similar to colonies. So these were territories that were administered by Western powers. The colonies hoped that by helping the European powers, they would gain independence. They saw the Allies giving self-determination rule to parts of Europe and thought, hey, they might give it to us as well. However, the self-determination was only specific for parts of Europe. The Allies didn't want to give up their colonies, they didn't want to give up their power. The Allies ended up, instead of giving independence, they ended up taking more colonies for themselves from Germany, from Austria-Hungary, from the Ottoman Empire. They had mandates with them. In theory, the mandates were to be held until these colonies were able to stand by themselves. So they took over, like I said, territory owned by Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and then they were to help these colonies, these territories, become their own independent country. That was the idea behind it, which sounds awesome, but what ended up happening is they became European colonies. Once you have power, it's always hard to give up power. You want to continue to maintain it, or you want to improve or gain more of it. All right, and then finally, the League of Nations offers hope. So more than 40 nations joined the League of Nations. Again, this is Woodrow Wilson's idea, the United States president. Instead of just going straight to war, they would negotiate disputes rather than, like I said, go to war. So with this event happening, if there's a trigger between Austria-Hungary with the assassination, they can talk about it and try and figure out a peaceful solution instead of just declaring war. They would take common action against any aggressor. So anyone that was really aggressive, that wanted to create war, you'd have 40 nations that would stand up and fight it. At least that was the idea. So Wilson was pretty much stoked on the idea that, you know what, he had a compromise on some of his 14 points, but the League of Nations was happening. However, the power to sign a treaty does not fall under the President of the United States. Do you guys know who it falls under? It's a good guess, Prime Minister. No. It falls under the Senate, which that's part of the checks and balances with the United States government. So the President does not have absolute power. The Senate has to approve the treaty. Well, Wilson comes back, and again, he's excited. He feels like he's created a really good idea with the League of Nations. However, the Senate resisted. They wanted to restrict the treaty. So that way, the United States, if they joined the League of Nations, they would not be forced to fight anyone. The United States wanted to remain isolated. However, Wilson disagreed with that, so the Senate refused to ratify or sign the treaty. And the United States was one of the main superpowers at this time, and so without the United States in the League of Nations, the League became very weak, and the League ended up unable to prevent war at the future time in 20 years. So the League of Nations was there. As we'll learn with Hitler, he would try something, the League of Nations would pretty much slap him on the wrist, then he'd go further. Slap on the wrist, keep taking whatever he wanted. Any questions for Making the Peace.